When it comes to psychedelics, rational dialogue is important, critical thinking is important, and context is super important, because a lot of what happens in this space by any normal standard is extremely bizarre. With all that in mind, I'm going to take another look at this situation that's been unfolding between the website Psymposia and 5-MeO DMT practitioner Martin Ball, relating to whether or not he has been abusing his clients, which is a pretty serious allegation. And the reason I think it's worth revisiting is that over the last couple of weeks, this situation seems to have escalated, with Psymposia having released multiple videos and social media posts about Martin Ball, and Martin responding via his podcasts, and loads of people weighing in on the various online forums. Now, there are some really interesting conversations that could be being had around this situation. For example, how do we handle consent around these extreme altered states? Should we insist on certain safety protocols during psychedelic sessions? And is there one size that fits all in terms of how a psychedelic experience should be facilitated? All topics worth exploring along with many others. But what I'm seeing instead is that people are neglecting those things that we should be discussing and instead just jumping straight into the drama and working themselves up into a kind of moral hysteria. And I think this is a problem. Hysteria has no place within a productive conversation. It's irrational, it's tedious, and it's always less interesting than the actual truth. So, as always, I'm going to try and cut through the bullshit. That's why in this video, I'm going to look at the case against Martin Ball that Psymposia has put forward. I'm going to give my analysis on the strength of their argument and see what conclusions I draw from it, along with my own take on how it might have been handled better. I do want to stress that I am coming at this from an impartial viewpoint. Impartial meaning treating all rivals or disputants equally. So it's not that I'm pro Martin Ball, I don't have an axe to grind with Psymposia, and realistically I don't have any particular allegiance to either of them. My allegiance is to rationality, so that's the star by which I will be navigating. Now, all that said, being impartial doesn't mean that I don't have an opinion on this topic, because I definitely do, and I will give you a logical explanation of how I came to my conclusions, which is based on the evidence at hand as well as my own thought processes. And then you can make up your own mind as to whether I'm full of shit or not. So I'm going to split this video into different sections, each covering a certain aspect, and I will leave timestamp links in the description below. In part 1, I'm going to recap the situation. In part 2, I'll do a deep dive into the evidence for these accusations. In part 3, I'll talk about the direction I think Psymposia should have taken this. And then in part 4, I will address some specific issues I have about how this situation was handled. And this one might get a little bit spicy. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's kick things off with a quick recap, and many of you will already know this, so I'll make it the abridged version. Martin Ball is a now retired psychedelic facilitator who previously ran sessions with 5-MeO DMT, and I think it's fair to say that some of his therapeutic practices were extremely weird and not the kind of thing that most people would be comfortable with. In very extreme cases, these sessions might involve people vomiting in on each other, licking each other, or being touched in intimate areas. Yeah, I think we can see why this turned into a hot topic. Martin has always been fairly open about what his practice involves. He's written books about it, and in 2016 he gave a lecture at LAMP's conference where he talked about the kind of things I just mentioned within the context of these were the times when things got really fucking strange. And that video has been available on YouTube since then. Enter on the scene Psymposia, a team of 8 people who comment on psychedelic culture, and they edited this 2-hour lecture down into an 11-minute video, which I think would be fair to say stripped it of all the context and just highlighted the most shocking bits. From here, they followed up with a social media campaign with various tweets, Facebook posts and subsequent videos to drive their point home, where they publicly stated that Martin Ball had committed sexual assault, was molesting people, and is a serial abuser. And this had the fairly predictable result of whipping their audience up into a frenzy, to the point where the comment sections on their videos, Martin is now being labelled as a pervert, sociopath, psychopath, and one of those people who shouldn't be allowed around children. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So, like I said, these are very serious allegations, which would require some very substantial evidence. So the question is, do Psymposia have the evidence to justify these very serious allegations? Now, I spoke to Martin Ball a few weeks ago to get his version of events, and I also made the same offer for a good faith conversation to Psymposia, but they didn't take me up on that for reasons which I think will become fairly apparent, and we'll get into that in more detail later on. Now, after talking to Martin Ball and reflecting on my own experiences with some fairly extreme versions of psychedelics, including Bufo, ayahuasca, and many more traditional medicines, it seemed to me that the whole axis around which this thing revolves is consent. Did these people who were having these sessions with Martin Ball know what they were signing up for? In that, was it consensual? And if the answer to that question is no, then obviously we have a major fucking problem. But if the answer to that is yes, then there really isn't any justification for the kind of allegations Psymposia are making. Let's assume for the moment it was consensual. And then the question becomes, do we, as consenting adult human beings, have the right to make sovereign decisions about our own experience? Or to put it another way, am I allowed to subject myself to something you might not agree with? And to me, this is a no-brainer. Yes, of course I do, no matter how weird or gross it sounds. Otherwise, this is just puritanical authoritarians telling people what they can or cannot do with their own existence. Now, I do think it's more complicated than that, so we'll explore this in more depth in part 3. And we'll really get into the questions I think we should be asking. But for now, let's just stick with this idea of consent and try and tackle this from both sides, starting with the evidence which Psymposia is using as a foundation to build their case on. What evidence is there that Martin Ball abused his clients? So Symposia's argument seems to revolve around two main pieces of evidence. Martin Ball's own words from the Lamps lecture detailing certain events within his practice, and 3 Facebook comments where someone says that someone they know had a bad experience with Martin. Now, I don't want to strawman or misrepresent anyone, so if I'm missing some critical piece of evidence, then please let me know. But to my knowledge, that, what I've just outlined, is it in terms of actual evidence. It's from these 2 sources that Psymposia is trying to have Martin Ball cancelled and branded as a sexual abuser, and so it's from these same sources that I'm going to come to my own conclusions. Now, I do just want to say that I'm completely open to the idea that I am totally wrong. So if the smoking gun appears that exposes Martin Ball as a monster, then I will adjust my opinion to follow the evidence. But based on what there is today, this is it. And honestly, it doesn't hold water. Okay, so first the video. It certainly describes some events which many people would consider gross, intrusive, or unnecessary, and I wouldn't disagree with that assessment. But it also describes them as being completely consensual and actually desired by the client. Not only did they know what they were signing up for, they signed up for it specifically because it was so extreme. I can certainly relate to this because I have put myself through many extreme practices in my own journey with psychedelics, and the reason I did it is precisely that I wanted the extreme version. Now, if I was so inclined, I could describe those events in very black and white terms, completely stripped of context, and make them sound utterly horrific. Here's an example. The shaman grunted and took a glowing stick from the fire and pushed it against the top of my arm, burning off the skin as I yelled out in pain. He ignored my cries and scratched at the burns with his long fingernails to expose the red, raw flesh beneath, into which he rubbed toxic frog venom. Immediately, I dropped to the floor and began to vomit profusely as my face, lips and throat began to swell. It felt like a severe allergic reaction, and there were no medically trained personnel nearby to help me. It was a horrible ordeal. That was a real situation that happened to me on a plant medicine retreat in Peru, and it was extremely unpleasant. Now, anyone could watch that clip and come to the conclusion that some weird shit is going down at that centre and that I was a victim of abuse. Except I wasn't. In fact, I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. It's what's called a Kambo ceremony, which I'd actively chosen to take part in and consented to having that experience. And I knew going in that it would involve being burned, extreme bodily discomfort, severe vomiting, and that it would leave physical scars. And all that said, afterwards, I felt fucking great. The context of me signing up for that experience and how I felt about it afterwards are critical to the overall story. You can't just pick out the bit about the burnt flesh and the allergic reaction and conflate that into the entirety of the story. To do so would be incredibly dishonest. And that is what Psymposia have done with their edit of Martin's lecture. They have stripped away all the context, all the bits where he describes these as fringe outlier cases and all the bits where he describes how happy these people were with the session. And instead they reduced it down to a frame of Martin Ball does weird stuff, I don't like it, it's gross, therefore it's sexual abuse. This is why I've previously described Symposia's edit as a bad faith interpretation of what Martin Ball was saying. It's not that Psymposia are making this stuff up, but they are being very selective in what they reveal, while leaving out the bits that would vindicate Martin. It looks to me like they've already have a conclusion and they're simply cherry picking out the juicy bits of weirdness to fulfill their narrative. And I think this factors into why they are so reluctant to have an open discussion about this outside of their little bubble. Because once you get that full story, which includes consent, then they really don't have as much to work with. I also find it weird that Psymposia brand themselves as this very progressive left-leaning group, but yet they seem to be overly obsessed with what consenting adults do behind closed doors. I mean, isn't this the behaviour we usually associate with like religious ultra-conservatives? It doesn't sound very progressive to me. I'm reminded of the classic eat the poo-poo meme in which an African pastor whips himself and his audience into a frenzy by obsessing over what homosexual people might be doing behind closed doors.
I've taken time to do a little research to know what homosexuals do in the privacy of their bedroom. One of the things they do is called anal leaking, where a man's anus is leaked like this by the other person, like ice cream. And then what happens, even poo-poo comes out, the other poo-poo's out, and then they eat the poo-poo. I mean, look at this guy sincerely. Bishop, we do not want this sickness. This is sick, and it's therefore deviant. We do not want it.
Just like I can look at this religious fanatic foaming at the mouth about what gay people are doing and find him to be utterly absurd, I'm looking at Psymposia the same way, and the thought on my mind is, if it's consensual, is it any of your fucking business what they do? Now, I don't want anyone to be confused that I'm 100% okay with what Martin describes here, because I am not. And most people, myself included, when initially hearing about the puking and the licking that might happen in one of these 5-MeO DMT sessions, will have a reaction something along the lines of, this does not sound okay. And I think the reason that most of us have that reaction is that we recognise that there is indeed a potential for abuse here. And our first thought is always to map that experience onto ourselves or the people we love the most and think, would I be okay with this happening to me? Would I be okay with this happening to my wife? And in my case, my gut reaction was, no, I wouldn't. And again, this is why it's so important that we have a rational conversation, because there are no doubt people out there looking to take advantage of others, and there are discussions we need to have. The thing here is that it's critical that we recognise the difference between things that we wouldn't want to go through personally and whether we have any right to tell other people what they should or shouldn't do, regardless of how gross or dangerous we might think those practices are. After all, there are plenty of experiences I would not want to go through personally. I wouldn't want to climb El Capitan without any safety gear. I wouldn't want to get my teeth knocked out in an MMA fight. I wouldn't want to have a 10-inch dildo shoved up my arse. Now, some of these activities people might be uncomfortable with, some are outright dangerous, But yet people do these things, and as far as I'm concerned, that's their right, whether I agree with it or not. So just because I personally don't want to do something doesn't mean there is something fundamentally wrong, immoral, or abusive about it. But yet clearly there is a line where abuse or negligence could happen around many of these extreme activities. And as we've already discussed, Martin Ball was definitely operating within that realm. So where is the line? Well, as I've already said, I think the line is consent. So unless Psymposia can prove that Martin Ball acted in a way that violated consent, then I don't think they have a case. And again, just because something is inappropriate doesn't mean it's without consent. I mean, a person can consent to having 15 guys shit into their face while being high on DMT. And yeah, that sounds fucking gross. And yes, I think that's inappropriate. And no, that definitely isn't the kind of image I want psychedelics to be associated with. And yes, I personally would be highly critical of anyone partaking in such a scat-themed psychedelic event. But being critical of someone is an entirely different thing from trying to get them cancelled and labelled as a sexually abusive predator. Next, we'll take a look at Psymposia's second piece of evidence, which was some comments from Facebook, which you can see here. And I just want to reiterate and state the obvious in that these are Facebook comments. And as you can see, they all start with a variation of, I know someone that. Now, I personally would not take any social media comment as definitive proof of anything. Otherwise, given the messages that I receive on a daily basis, my mama would have sucked a whole lot of dicks, which would be pretty amazing since she's been dead for the last 40 years. But if we actually read these comments, then a bigger problem emerges, because they are all written from the perspective of someone I know, which makes these comments the literal definition of hearsay. Information received from other people which cannot be substantiated. Rumour. The report of another person's words by a witness which is usually disallowed as evidence in a court of law. Now, I'm amazed this needs explaining to a group like Psymposia, which claims to be journalists, but this is not in any way evidence for anything, but yet they are posting it all over the internet as though it's a smoking gun. It isn't. I mean, you don't have to be some kind of legal expert to know this. Have you guys never watched Judge Judy? You think she would accept these Facebook posts of someone talking about someone they know and speaking on their behalf as rock solid evidence?
I want you to stop getting hysterical over nothing.
No, of course she wouldn't. Nobody with any amount of common sense would accept this as it stands right here as any kind of evidence with which to accuse another human of sexual abuse. That is insane. A Facebook comment just on its own is not evidence for jack shit. An unsubstantiated Facebook comment written by someone else on behalf of someone they may or may not know is worth less than jack shit. You know, I've been in this situation myself where someone has sent me a juicy comment via social media which piqued my interest, but you cannot just take these things at face value. You have to do a bit of work to actually get to the truth of the matter. Now, I do hope this doesn't come off as too patronising, but let me explain how I have handled things like this previously. Now, when I was making a video about the ayahuasca organisation Inner Mastery and them having cult-like tendencies, I was contacted by someone who claimed to be a high-rank insider at Inner Mastery and who had some evidence of wrongdoing. That was the comment. And while it was certainly intriguing just on its own, it's not evidence. So I reached out to them and I asked some questions and I got them to send me some proof that they were who they said they were and that they actually did hold this position within the organisation. And the source came back to me and provided that proof by emails, WhatsApp conversations and pictures which backed up his story. The guy then went on record and made a video statement of his own personal experience, and that was what I included in my video, which provided a pretty rock solid basis for any criticism of that organisation. This is what's called evaluating your sources, and it's a fairly standard practice within reputable journalism, and I'll leave a link in the description below so you guys at Psymposia can read all about it. You're welcome. But isn't this kind of thing completely fucking obvious? I mean, how is it that an uneducated, foul-mouthed prick like me seemingly knows more about journalistic standards than the entire 8-person team with a 4-person advisory board over at Psymposia. I mean, the actual team member of Psymposia who's been creating all this drama does actually have a degree in journalism. So what gives, Russell? Did you skip that day when they talked about journalistic standards and how to validate sources? No, I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark that Psymposia haven't done any of the things that I did, or that if they did, they didn't get the evidence they wanted back from it. Because if they had, then they would be shouting from the rooftops. But they haven't. Still, that hasn't stopped them plastering the original hearsay Facebook quotes all over the place like it's a murder weapon covered in fingerprints. And based on everything I've just covered, I find this to be completely fucking absurd. And whatever credibility I was willing to grant Psymposia is starting to disappear. And to me, they are looking more like bad actors who are looking to push a particular narrative, regardless of whether it's true or not. Now again, I'm absolutely open to having my mind changed, and if Psymposia follow up on these leads and get something more substantial, then I will reassess my position, as any rational person would. But as of right now, based on what's on the table, I don't think Psymposia have got anything close to the kind of evidence they would need to accuse someone of committing sexual abuse. And I want to be clear, none of this is to say that Martin Ball is innocent. He might be a serial killer for all I know, but what I'm saying is that none of this right now is proof of anything other than Martin Ball did 5-MeO DMT ceremonies where consenting adults did some freaky shit. Also, I want to be clear here that I'm not just specifically addressing Psymposia themselves. I'm also talking to their followers who really took this narrative of abuse, ran with it, and conflated it into child molestation. And when I talked earlier about hysteria, this is it. And this is all playing out in the comment section on Symposia's videos, and it's painfully predictable, given the language that they're using to whip their audience into a frenzy. And this comes back to what I talked about. This is not reasonable conversation. This is not good for the community. This is tabloid level garbage. And I know that Psymposia reads its comment section, which says to me that they are okay with generating this kind of outrage rather than generating rational discourse, which is disappointing. Honestly, if I was Psymposia, I would be embarrassed by these kind of responses from my audience, but if they're cool with it, then so be it. Okay, so I think we've covered all the evidence or lack thereof, so let's move on to the next section. I think it's fairly obvious that I am of the opinion that Psymposia has handled this whole situation extremely poorly, and that their claims around Martin Ball are unsubstantiated. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anything here worth talking about, because I think there definitely is. In fact, I would say that some of the topics you could get from this are critical talking points within the psychedelic renaissance. So I'm absolutely baffled as to why Psymposia chose to drag this into the tabloid gutter rather than to apply a bit of critical thinking and use it as a launchpad to bigger and much more interesting conversations. So in this section, I'm going to look at some of the issues that occurred to me while watching this thing play out. And I want to be clear that I'm not offering any answers here. This is just what I think we should be talking about. Consent and psychedelics. On the surface, consent seems like a fairly binary topic. I can consent to something, but that consent can be withdrawn at any time. And I think this is something we would all agree with. However, there are certain situations where just by the very nature of the experience, once they are underway, there isn't any feasible way of tapping out of them. Here are some examples. Surgery. Once the anaesthetic goes in and you are unconscious, you cannot withdraw consent. Skydiving. Once you jump off the plane, you are in it. There is no withdrawing of consent in mid-air, regardless of whether you're doing it solo or whether you're strapped to someone else. Psychedelics. You take the substance and you're going to have the experience, and that is pretty much that. So we can see that there is some nuance that we're going to have to work out. Do we need a third party to be present to act on our behalf? Well, then what about if we're doing things in our own home? Would we impose whatever we decide onto traditional medicine in other countries, Like you're going to go and start telling some peyote shaman that they need to start doing things according to your Western standards, and that if they don't, then they are being abusive. Let's look at another possible topic, safety. Do psychedelic practitioners need to have some basic level of first aid training? If so, according to what standards? Is it our Western standards? And if so, again, are we going to enforce that on traditional medicine? Would we say that any ayahuasca retreat in Peru that doesn't have a Western trained first aider is dangerous? What does this mean for personal use? If I want to host a 5-MeO DMT ceremony at my house with some of my friends, do I need to hire a first aid person? I would assume not. But what's the difference between that and what Martin Ball is doing? These are all genuine questions which I think we as a community are going to have to get our heads around, rather than selectively choosing which bits we ignore so that we can have a juicy bit of outrage drama. You know, one that really got me thinking was Martin Ball's description of a client violently attacking him. Because the last time I did psychedelics, I was at home with my wife. I mean, what would happen if I had a psychotic break and started attacking her? I mean, that would be devastating for her, for me, for our marriage, for our kids, and all that just from rolling the psychedelic dice. Now, obviously, just as Martin described in the unedited lecture with context, these are fringe cases, but it did make me stop and think. So I am absolutely serious that these are extremely complicated issues, which we as a psychedelic community are going to have to grapple with. It's not easy, it's not black and white. And so for Psymposia to reduce the entire topic down to, oh my God, this guy's being sick on people, I don't like him. It's just such a missed opportunity. And honestly guys, I think you really dropped the ball on this one. And again, it's ridiculous that I need to keep saying this, but none of this is to say that Martin Ball is right in his practice, or that we shouldn't be questioning what he does. But realistically, the only people who have any credibility in saying what did or did not happen within his sessions is his clients. And so far, no one has actually logged any kind of complaint. So all this talk of abuse is simply Psymposia projecting on behalf of someone else. And if someone managed to resolve grief or trauma by having him puke all over them, then who can say otherwise? I certainly can't, and neither can Psymposia. What we can do is be critical of his methods. After all, I am a firm believer that no one is above criticism. But that criticism, like this, needs to be rational and level-headed, not hysterical. I mean, is there potential for someone becoming traumatized by what goes on in one of Martin Ball's sessions? I think there probably is, just like there is with any psychedelic substance, and probably even more so since he deals more or less exclusively with 5-MeO DMT. I mean, you see what I mean? There is a shit ton to talk about and possible avenues to explore, and I pulled these ideas off the top of my head in about 5 minutes. This is what this video should have been. This is what your video should have been, Psymposia. Stuff where there is actually some basis for conversation. Not just stuff about whether some dude in California has enthusiasm for being sick on people. So there you go, Psymposia. Since you seem to struggle in formulating a productive conversation without resorting to tabloid trash, consider these topics a gift from me to you, and hopefully they'll keep you busy for a while. But then that raises the question, how did they end up going down this rabbit hole of journalistic sewage in the first place? And why do they keep doubling down on it? Part 4. The problem with Psymposia. Okay guys, so everything I've covered so far is me trying to unpack this thing and explain as rationally as I can why I don't agree with what Psymposia are doing. I'm simply looking at what's been presented, and I've come to the conclusion that Psymposia don't have much of a case for the claims they are making. I think they've taken it too far, and until they get something more substantial, then they should let it go. I hope that I've explained my perspective clearly, and that I've been fair and somewhat balanced in my criticism. So there you go. Now, I wish that I could say that that was the end of it, but it wasn't, because then Psymposia tried coming after me by implying I was an anti-Semite and that I was too scared to debate with them, even though I offered to speak to them multiple times. And you know what? I just thought, fuck it. Some people are just so far up their own arse that they can't be reasoned with. They aren't looking to understand a situation or have a reasoned conversation. They're looking to be right and to have everyone agree about how right they are. And if the facts of the matter don't match their narrative of what is right, then they'll simply obscure and distort the facts until they do. And that's certainly what they've done here with Martin Ball. Like this line they tried using against me of being anti-Semitic, which is just preposterous. But a quick look through their social media feed and you'll see this is just a common tactic for them, in that they completely ignore any reasonable disagreement and simply start calling people Nazis and racist and anti-trans, just whatever mud they think will stick, and it's so fucking lazy that I find it hard to take you guys seriously. This isn't journalism, it's absolute shite. Sensationalised, divisive, hysterical shite. And I made this section to give you guys a reality check. Now, I was absolutely genuine when I said I came into this from an impartial mindset, but after watching you guys twist and turn and deliberately obscure your way through this, there can only come to the conclusion that you are either bad actors, or that you completely lost touch with reality, or that you have zero understanding of the space you are commenting on. Possibly, it's all three. Because things get very strange within the psychedelic space, and that isn't an excuse, it's a fucking fact. So your worldview needs to be a lot wider than what you're currently displaying it is. Get your head around the idea of a bigger context than your narrow-minded, limited safe space bullshit. Because psychedelics, like something like rock climbing, are not necessarily safe. I mean, sure, there should be a nice, safe version for people to dip their toe into. I would totally agree with that. And for sure, Martin Ball is not that. But the psychedelic landscape is so vast and deep that you cannot sanitize the whole thing into the equivalent of a shallow kiddie pool. Because some of us want to experience the deep waters. And none of that is to say you cannot criticize things. In my eyes, no person or idea is above criticism. But there is a world of difference between criticizing a person and broadcasting that they are a serial sexual abuser without a shred of fucking evidence. And I'm dumbfounded that I actually needed to explain that to you. And equally dumbfounded that none of you had the common sense or the spine to speak up about this. Guys, maybe we should wait until some actual evidence before smearing someone's reputation all over the internet.
Shut the fuck up, you Nazi!
You know, I was watching a few of Psymposia's videos as research for this piece, and there is one where they're doing a live stream and really sniffing each other's farts about how controversial they are.
And we're controversial, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're not controversial because you're like the cutting edge of psychedelic investigative journalism. You're controversial because you act like complete arseholes. Every time I see one of you guys pop up on Facebook or Reddit, it's like some glitched out authoritarian android copying and pasting the same tired nonsense.
Psymposia is always right. Everyone who disagrees is an anti-Semite racist.
To me, this becomes a question of, where did this all go wrong? And as with any organisation, the answer is always with the guy in charge. And in the case of Psymposia, it's managing editor David Nichols. Hi David, it's me, the anti-Semite, the one who's been dodging you. Now, I've had a few interactions with David, as well as watching him blunder his way through multiple conversations with other members of the psychonaut community, and after a bit of reasoned analysis, I think it's fair to say that he is an utter bellend. I mean, if this is the guy who is shouldering the responsibility for editorial standards, ethics, and leadership at Psymposia, then yeah, it's not particularly surprising that they are pumping out this kind of turgid, sensationalist bollocks. And if that's what they want to do, then fine. But I think we can safely dispel the perception that these guys are rational actors who we should be entrusting to police the psychedelic community. They aren't. Not with this guy at the helm. And I would like to address David Nichols personally around his claim that I was dodging him, because it's just so funny and it's almost a perfect microcosm of this entire reality warping narrative that goes on with Psymposia. So David, let me be blunt. I think it's pretty obvious why you didn't take me up on my offer for a live conversation. And it's because I would absolutely fucking eviscerate you. As I've already demonstrated throughout this entire video, your argument is built on the thinnest of ice, factually, intellectually, and ethically. You do not have a fucking leg to stand on. You have the audacity to dictate what consenting adults can or cannot do, like some puritanical, ultra-conservative, authoritarian lunatic. And this is a complete contradiction of the level-headed left-wing position you claim to espouse. And in a live conversation with me, this would all become painfully apparent for you and your audience, and I would imagine that will get pretty awkward for you. So it's no surprise you want to avoid that embarrassment. Still, I'm all about having the conversations and building bridges, so the offer is still there, David, just like it always was. I mean, my audience space is bigger than yours, David. My videos get more views than yours, and if you have a rock solid case, then this is a win-win for you. And as I said many times, I'm perfectly willing to change my mind if you can present some decent evidence. So, you tell me, David, who is dodging whom? Well, that was fun, and hopefully this video has injected a shot of critical thinking into the psychonaut community and made us maybe just a little bit less prone into being provoked into witch-hunting bloodlust by certain bad actors. I would hope that this is the end of this whole debacle, but honestly, I think what is likely to happen is that Psymposia will double down again. They'll ramp it up a gear and start mining through all my content for quotes which prove that I was once an anti-trans satanic cannibal or something. And to Psymposia, honestly guys, I think you should take a good long look at yourselves and think hard if this is who you want to be and just who is steering the ship. And I don't think you're all bad guys, and bizarrely I think in some alternate universe we would probably be on the same side. But you have misfired so spectacularly that it's going to take some serious course correction to rebuild your credibility, because this campaign has not gone down particularly well in the psychonaut community. And it's not just because we are in favour of people being abused, it's because we can smell the obvious bullshit. Still, it's not like I hate you or anything, so if you ever want that chat, then just send me a message and drop the nonsense that I've been dodging you, okay? Right guys, that's all for this video. I hope you found it useful, and I have to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon. I've been a little bit slow with new content this last month because I've been on vacation, so thank you guys so much for your patience. If anyone wants to chat with me about this or any other topic, you can do so via the Adeptus Psychonautica Discord or Reddit, or you can leave me a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time on Adeptus Psychonautica.